Good morning, friends. Ma Devi here. I am doing the third part of the study of the Bible, and today we're going to talk about the book of Luke. The book of Luke, so Luke, like Mark and Matthew, wrote a synopsis of Jesus's life in his testament, in his gospel. And he was a contemporary of Mark. So Mark and Luke, unlike Matthew, who was a disciple of Jesus, um, Mark and Luke were disciples of disciples. And so they were those who were followers. Mark, a follower of Peter, and Luke, a follower, it seems, of Paul. So they were writing at a kind of a similar time. And if you look back to the image for today, Luke is represented by the man or angel. He was a physician, and he represented Jesus as a friend, a merciful friend to the people. He dedicated the book of Luke as well as the book of Acts, which he also wrote. It's called Acts of the Apostles. And we're going to talk about both the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles today because they really are intertwined. He dedicated them to someone named Theophilus. And what he was doing, the name Theophilus seems to be, it could have been a person's name, but it's also a title. So it was kind of his title for the Gentiles who were resisting the messages of the Christ because they had no, background in that. So they weren't the Jews who knew of the story of Judaism. He's mostly speaking to people who are being converted from the life of Gentiles, means non-Jews. So he dedicated to Theophilus, and his writing was done in order to provide certainty and assurance that the early church representatives, so the disciples of Jesus, the apostles, and the ones who followed them, including himself and Saul and others like Barnabas that we'll talk about, that they were following the ways of the Christ. So he is a, say, second generation um, evangelist, and that is why he wrote this book, and it became part of the canon. And so the canon is the official Catholic um, agreement that these are the stories that are most valid and the ones that the church puts forth as true. So that's something to think in the back of your mind. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those four are canonical gospels, as I said um, in the last episode. Okay, so this is a Gentile writing to other Gentiles, so you can consider it that way. He is writing to the poor, the outcast, the marginalized people of his time. So these could be slaves, these could be, just poor people in any country that they're traveling in, wanting them to know the story of the Christ and also wanting them to know that those who followed the Christ, his disciples and apostles, and those who followed them, were all following the same gospel, the same story, and the same um, admonitions that Jesus made for people about how to live their lives. So it's the story of salvation, the story of how the life of Jesus fulfills the prophecies of the Judaic tradition and the Old Testament, and it also relates to contemporary history. So the scholars who study such things, they look for how can they find this person in the timeline of history. And Luke does a good job of referring to people and places that can be found even from our 2000 plus year distance. And so that's one of the ways that this particular book was taken into the canon. So it's legitimizing Christianity for those who are just hearing about it and representing validity to Rome as a Judaic tradition. So the Jews were already, I don't want to say accepted by Rome because Rome was the Rome ruled Israel, and so the Jews were tolerated, like we could say tolerated. Their tradition was tolerated, and so the early Christians, although they weren't calling themselves Christians, they were trying to have equal standing with Rome. So knowing that the Jews and Rome, worked together in the crucifixion of Jesus, that these continuers were going to teach, continue to heal, continue to gather people and claim the right to have their own tradition as followers of Jesus. And they also, in the book of Luke, are trying to get people to understand how to live as Christians, as followers of the Christ, until the second coming that Jesus promised. Some other significant things about the book of Luke are that it's a little bit longer than Mark, which is kind of the Mark is kind of the really kind of down and dirty like synopsis of more like outline. In the book of Luke, he talks about Mother Mary, and the Magnificat of Mother Mary is in the book of Luke. It's not in the other books. He talks about angels. He talks about the death of Judas, the apostle Judas, and his betrayal of Jesus. And he also talks about, in the Acts of the Apostles, about how they went about replacing Judas as one of the 12 with Matthias, who was also a follower. He talks about how to live. It's a more detailed gospel than the book of Mark, and he focuses on the importance of prayer and the mercy and compassion of Jesus. So these are kind of the feeling that you get of it. Some people believe that Luke wrote after, although contemporary with Mark, wrote after Mark, and in order to just validate and support what Mark was saying, but then maybe expand on it some. Some of the unique stories and parables that show up in the book of Luke that are not in Matthew and Mark are the parable of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the prodigal son, and the parable of Jesus after the resurrection, meeting the disciples on the road to Emmaus, where he showed up after the ascension and did not reveal himself as the Christ. And then they talked with him and invited him in. And then once they had broken bread with him, Jesus showed himself. So they were people who were faithful followers, sad because of what had happened, were returning home, trying to figure out what to do now. And then Jesus showed up with them. And, as he did with many people during the time that he, after his, between the resurrection and ascension, showed up to many, many people to give them hope. So again, Luke also wrote the Acts of the Apostles. And this is important because he was one who was educated enough to write in great detail about what was happening in his time, what was happening with the disciples, and writing to and about where those disciples went, what they were doing, how they were creating Christian communities all over the place, what their relationship was with Rome and with the traditional Jews after the death of Jesus. So this is after, it's written about the disciples and apostles after the ascension. And again, talks about, so very clearly it is expressing what happened to the apostles after Jesus ascended. So we know that we had the descent of the Holy Spirit, and we know that Jesus had sent them out to preach and teach. And we know that Judas died. So then they did cast lots to see who would be the replacement apostle for Judas. And casting lots, praying and casting lots was kind of an early form of divination. How do we know? How do we discern who would be the next person? And so that's how they did it. That's how they got Matthias to be one of the apostles. You don't hear a lot about Matthias in the Bible. There were many followers, and many of them very devout. And of course, mostly we hear about the ones who became the apostles, and not just the apostles, but the apostles who go on to write the letters and that you hear about in the Acts and all of that. And so, generally speaking, that's going to be, the big names like Peter, the brothers John and James. Philip, Thomas, the ones who we know a lot about from the Bible. The other ones, it's not that they're not there, it's not that they're not active, it's just they're not written in the synopsis or the description as much as those, first 5 or 6 who, Matthew, 5 or 6 who either are in the Gospels or, as you've seen if you've watched Chosen, there are some who are kind of sitting back a little bit, and it's not that they don't have something to offer, but they're not in the front like John and Andrew and Peter and James. So the Acts of the Apostles does cover the Pentecost, and then when the apostles are blessed and going out to teach to heal, and to convert people to Jesus's teachings. So as they're leaving Jerusalem after Jesus dies and ascends, and they have their mission now, Jesus sending them out, Peter scolds Jerusalem before he leaves, reminding them of the prophecies, reminding them that this actually was the Messiah that they killed, that they fulfilled the prophecy of killing him, and that proved that who he was. Now, many people converted even at that time when Peter was professing that in Jerusalem, and many people, just like when Jesus was alive, it was causing a kerfuffle in the city, because the Romans didn't want more people gathering. They didn't want more animosity between the Jews and the followers of Jesus. And so, it was continuing Jesus's work, not only in teaching, but also in creating a disturbance. And he also, when he converted people, they also received the confirmation, which is either the actual laying on of hands that brought the confirmation of the Holy Spirit on them. So the baptism was one thing, and then the confirmation was another thing. As you know, in our tradition, we do both of those at the same time, generally because the baptism is the washing clear and forgiveness, receiving forgiveness, and the confirmation is igniting the Holy Spirit in your being. In that time, as Christian communities, although they didn't call themselves Christian yet, as the communities who were following Jesus started to develop in different places, they began to live in a way that they shared their wealth and their possessions. And so that's kind of reminiscent of the communities before Jesus, like the communities that Jesus's parents and Anna and Mary's parents, they were in a tradition, an esoteric tradition that's called the Essenes, and it is hypothesized, and there's some information that shows that those Essenes were living in that same kind of way. So Jesus wasn't bringing something that was completely new, but his life was transforming, opening the way through him taking on the karma of the world, opening the way for people to be free to live in that way, for their consciousness to rise enough to know that they could live in love, they could live in community, they could take care of one another. And so that's the way they were living. They shared their possessions, the rich and the poor, they took care of one another. They became a family of faith. And so these Christian communities, as the apostles went around to teach, they were teaching them love one another, take care of one another. And so they were following the ways of the Christ in ways that even people in our time don't, which is to share freely and to help their neighbors. So Peter and John in particular, were very prolific teachers and healers, and they went about teaching and healing. And Peter, of course, reprimanding Israel, but also telling them, we're going to reprimand you, but we will forgive you if you convert. Like you can still come into the fold. And so that was the message was, even though they had killed Jesus, they still could be redeemed. And so that's what they went about teaching. Peter and John were arrested in Jerusalem and warned to stop the teaching. They were causing a ruckus. Stop teaching in Jesus' name, and of course they refused to do that. And so what happened over the course of the Acts of the Apostles, you see John and Peter and some of the other apostles going out and teaching and having the same thing happen in every place they went, similar to Jesus, gathering people, teaching them, converting them, baptizing them, causing a disturbance, with those gatherings in different places. Healing people, doing signs and wonders that were miraculous, the same way Jesus did, and just converting a lot of people, and then moving on to another place. Even to the wonders of healing, even to the level of Peter walking by someone who had faith, and if his shadow fell upon them, they would be healed. Similar to the story about Jesus when the woman grabbed his tunic and she was healed because of his faith, because of her faith. And that's one of the things that, one of the teachings of Jesus is that you just have to believe. You just have to know that healing is possible. And then you can access the power of God to be healed, to heal and be healed. So they went about curing and converting many people. And over and over again were arrested for doing that. At one point, they were arrested and in prison, and an angel broke them out of prison. An angel showed up and said to Peter, get up and leave, and somehow unlocked the door and got the guards to be asleep or not paying attention, and so they left. And it was astounding to the authorities. But then, when they caught him again, they would beat him and cast him out of the town. And so there's many stories in the Acts of the Apostles that talk about the teaching, healing, persecution of the disciples. One of the Jewish elders called Gamaliel, he said to just let them be. Like if they're false prophets, God will take care of them, and if they're true prophets, then we should just let them be. So as they started moving around and creating these communities, of course, they couldn't stay with them because they were the evangelizers. And so they had to find people that would stay and work with the local community to make sure people were cared for. And those people are called deacons. And so all of our ministers here have been deacons at one point, and you know that deacons are the carers of the community, the chapel, and the hearts of the people. And so these 7 deacons to begin with were chosen to serve the locals when the apostles went on to the next place, teaching and healing and converting people. The first deacon's name was Stephen. And this is significant because Stephen is the first martyr of the Christ, which means he's the first one killed, like after Jesus, the first one killed because he was a follower of Jesus. So he was arrested on false pretenses because he also, having been converted, was so convicted in his faith that he was able to heal people, and he was also teaching and healing. And in his locale, where he was given the authority by the by the apostles to be the local minister, the local deacon. And when he was arrested, Stephen gave a speech, a very inspired speech, which is in the Acts of the Apostles. I'm not going to tell you all the things that happened because I really want you to read it so you can get the rest of the story after Jesus' ascension, the rest of the story of what the apostles did. So the thing about Stephen, he gave a speech that was astounding, and then it was upsetting to everyone. And there was a Jew there named Saul, and you probably remember that Saul later becomes Paul. But at that time, the time of the death of Stephen, or the time that Stephen was the deacon, he spoke back to the authorities, and they stoned him to death. And Saul was present for that. And Saul was a persecutor of Christians, a persecutor of the followers of Christ. He would seek them out even in their homes in Jerusalem and arrest them. And it said later, persecute them even unto death, as Stephen was killed. So Stephen's the first martyr, the first deacon, the first martyr, killed for being a follower of Jesus. Now, Philip the apostle went to Samaria and healed and converted many people, and baptized many people. Peter and John came, and they all supported each other in this mission of conversion, healing, and baptizing. And oftentimes in the Acts of the Apostle, there is witnessing to miraculous things happening, not just healings, but angels guiding them. And coincidences happening that made it so that they could get to the place they needed to be, like all the kinds of things that we're looking for, signs and wonders. And they were exquisitely obedient to the moment because they just did what the Spirit moved them to do, and they followed what the angels told them to do. And in the case of Philip going to see this Ethiopian eunuch that he was drawn to see, he taught the person, baptized them, and then disappeared. And so there's increasing numbers of signs and wonders that happen because of their faith. So back to Saul. So Saul was persecuting, arresting, and he wanted to go to Damascus to get permission to continue with this war he had against the Christians and get the Roman permission to arrest and persecute them. And so he was on the road to Damascus, and this is the story of his conversion. He was knocked off his horse by a bolt of light, and he became blind, and he heard Jesus' voice saying, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Why are you killing my followers? And so he hated the Christians, but the Christians were the ones that, picked him up and healed him. And after a couple of days of having this blindness and having Jesus' presence with him and having being cared for, he was completely converted. So going from Saul, to the Christian persecutor and killer, to Paul, the evangelizer, and really, the great evangelizer of his time. So this is after the apostles have, so you can see in the progression of time, the apostles are out teaching and healing, they're creating communities, then eventually they have to have deacons. When Stephen is killed, Saul is there. He's on the side of the Christian killers, and then he wants to get more power to do that, and then has a conversion experience on the way to Damascus. He then becomes an evangelizer right away. He's baptized, he gets up, he goes out. And so, of course, the people don't know what to do with that, because first, one minute he's saying, kill them, and the next minute he's saying, the Christ is real. So what he does is he goes about telling people the story of his conversion and what happened to him. So he's talking about this mystical experience, and the signs and wonders that happened to convert him. And so, of course, the people are uncertain. The Christians are wary of him, and the Jews are suspicious. And so he's having a hard time gaining followers, but he keeps telling his story nonetheless. The disciples accepted him because of his story. The Greeks wanted to kill him, and so he had to flee. He had to flee, and many of them, just like Jesus' story, when he got to a place where they didn't accept him or respect him, he would leave and go somewhere else, partly to be safe and partly to go on doing the work that he came to do, which is evangelizing. And he would shake the sand from his sandals and carry on with his work. So the church grows and spreads, and the peaceful communities are built and supported. And the apostles become these wandering bishops. And for those of you ministers who haven't read there's a manuscript called the Wandering Bishops, and it has to do with the lineage of bishops who did this kind of thing. They wandered around teaching, healing, and converting, baptizing. So that's what the apostles were doing. They were wandering bishops, and as bishops, they could pass along their authority to the deacons to baptize. And then eventually, when there was more kind of geography to cover, then they started ordaining priests, and that you can learn about that in the Wandering Bishops book if you'd like more information about that. So Peter's going on healing people, even raising people from the dead. People are having visions, all kinds of things are happening. They're getting directed where to go, who to preach to, baptizing people, and especially the Gentiles. So this is one of the things that is most offensive to the Jewish people of Jesus' time, is that he said if the Jews won't be converted, they will preach to the Gentiles, and the Gentiles will be converted to follow Jesus. They go to Antioch, which is kind of, I don't know where it is on the map now, somewhere between Greece and the Middle East. And in Antioch, there was a scattering of the disciples after the martyrdom of Stephen. So you can imagine that the deacon, their minister, was persecuted and killed, stoned to death, and people were afraid to be Christian at that time. And so, it was a scary time. So some of the disciples fled to Greece and other areas and continued preaching to the Jews and the Gentiles, and Saul was among them. Antioch is where the disciples first were calling themselves Christians, followers of the Christ. And so this is the generation of the apostles, not the generation of Luke and Mark who were writing about that time, but the generation of the apostles, and the apostles bringing people into power as deacons and later priests. So the rest of the book is about them traveling, doing signs and wonders, teachings, the plots against them, the persecution, the being arrested, fleeing to other areas, and setting up communities, and then becoming these wandering bishops. And this probably the second half, I would say, of the Acts of the Apostles is about Paul as the great evangelizer. So when you're reading it, it goes from the apostles of Jesus to Paul as the apostle, Paul and this other person, Barnabas. So Paul and Barnabas were contemporaries of Luke, and Luke was somewhat like a scribe, kind of like Matthew was, and in Jesus' time, writing down what was happening as it was happening. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Only Matthew and John were alive at the time of Jesus. At least their accounts, the accounts that got into the Bible that we know as the Bible, they're the accounts that were alive at the time of Jesus. But the Acts of the Apostles is the continuators, the continuators of the Christ in teaching and healing and converting and teaching people how to live as Jesus said to live, and in continuing that. And Paul was quite persistent, brave, bold, and he spoke many times about his conversion in order to convince people that even someone like him could have such an experience, and that it was an experience, a personal experience of Jesus that they had, that Paul had after he, even after he was persecuting and killing the Christians. So it was very compelling. His story is very compelling, and his evangelizing, of course, is quite famous. And he's called the great evangelizer, and he's considered an apostle, even though he wasn't one of the 12. They call him the Apostle Paul, because he was such a prolific continuer of Christianity and of the teachings of the Christ and of the transformation of people through Christ. So that is the book of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. I do encourage you, of course, I would assume that all of you as ministers have read the Gospels, and I encourage you to read the Acts of the Apostles as well. And then later, I'm going to go on to talk about the letters, or what's called the epistles, which are the letters of Paul to a bunch of different communities, and some the letters of Peter, and the letters of, I think, Philip. So there's the whole section that of the epistles are letters that the apostles are writing to the communities that they've set up in various places in order to stay in touch with them, in order to encourage them, in order to guide them, in order to say, pray for me, I've been arrested again. Paul wrote many letters saying, I'm in jail again, but I'm sending you this letter, pray for me. And, either admonishing the communities from what he's heard about what's going on, or encouraging them or supporting them in some way in these letters. And they're really beautiful letters. The thing about the epistles that, we'll talk more about later, is that much of modern conservative Christianity takes from the Gospels, from the letters, the epistles, instructions about how to live now. And so that becomes troublesome because they're not the teachings of Jesus. They're Paul guiding the people of his time in how to live as Christians. And of course, we know his time was very different from ours. Women were seen more as possessions than as people. Slaves and marginalized people were not necessarily considered. I mean, that's kind of the same now, isn't it? Not considered as equal to the Jews or the upper classes, that kind of thing. So we'll talk more about the epistles in my next round, but I encourage you to read the Acts because, first of all, it's the book that comes after John. So it's right after the four Gospels, and it kind of tells the rest of the story in terms of what did the apostles do after the ascension and the descent of the Holy Spirit. The next one that I will present to you will be John, which is very different. It is not a synoptic gospel. It's a very different gospel about the teachings of Jesus and what they mean, and different from just saying this and this and this happened over time. So I'll get back to you on that one. I won't say soon because I'm also preparing for the retreat right now, but I will say it's on my list of things to report back to you on, and I look forward to doing that when I get a chance. All right, hope you enjoyed today's lesson on the Bible.